The fork stalled halfway to my lips when I heard him, my own grandson, flesh of my flesh, whisper, "Just hurry up and die already." Still, I kept my eyes on the cake, letting the silver tap the plate with a calm so steady it terrified even me. As the sound tightened in my ears, the room blurred, and every laugh around the table curdled into a witness of what they all pretended not to hear. The same boy I once rocked to sleep now counted down the minutes to my funeral like prophet on a ledger. That's when I realized they hadn't lost me, they'd thrown me away. And so I vanished from their lives, leaving silence as the only thing they'll ever inherit. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Elaine sat at the end of the long, polished table, quietly watching the conversation swirl around her like a current. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the hum of voices, it all felt so distant, as if she were hovering just out of reach. She was 78 today, a fact that seemed to get lost in the shuffle of more pressing matters. It had been her choice to keep the celebration small, yet even in this familiar setting, the warmth she once felt from her family was absent. At the other end of the table, Matt, her grandson, slouched in his chair, scrolling through his phone with an air of impatience. The rest of the family continued chatting, oblivious to him, or perhaps just too used to his offhand remarks. When one of the cousins, a young woman named Claire, struggled to gather her things to leave, Matt's voice cut through the chatter, low but unmistakable. "Jesus, just hurry up and die already," he muttered, frustration thinly veiled behind his words. Elaine's fork paused midair. She didn't react, at least not outwardly. She heard it, clear as a bell. Claire froze, her face flushing a deep crimson. The noise in the room softened for a moment, everyone aware of the awkwardness that had bloomed like a sour fruit. But Matt didn't notice. Instead, he laughed. A short, dismissive laugh, like it was some private joke that only he was in on. "Just kidding," he added, though it wasn't clear who he was trying to reassure. Elaine didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her eyes remained fixed on her dessert, rich, smooth, and somehow the only thing in the room that didn't seem out of place. Each bite she took, slow and deliberate, was a quiet defiance. She wasn't ready to die, but she was ready for something else. Something that didn't involve Matt or the empty promises he threw like breadcrumbs. Mavis appeared at her side, as if summoned by some unspoken signal. The older woman gave her a knowing glance and helped her up from the table. The hum of voices followed them as they moved toward the door, but Elaine didn't turn around. She didn't need to see the looks of sympathy or the hurried whispers. She had heard it all before. Outside, the air felt cool, a slight contrast to the warmth of the house that had once felt like home. Elaine paused before getting into the car, the wind brushing against her skin. She wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't this, a sense of calm, of something almost sacred in the silence that enveloped her. Mavis opened the door and helped her in. As the engine started, Elaine spoke softly, her voice steady but filled with an underlying weight. "I'm not ready to die," she said, her eyes fixed straight ahead, "but I'm ready to vanish." Mavis didn't answer right away. She simply nodded, her hand resting on the door as the car pulled away. Elaine didn't need to explain further. She'd already made her decision. The silence that followed felt like a promise, one that Matt would only understand once it was too late. Elaine sat in her study, her fingers grazing the edge of the papers before her. The numbers, the words, they all blurred together. But her eyes kept returning to the will. Matt's name stood out, bold and certain, listed to receive 40% of her estate. 40%. It was a compromise, one forced upon her by Tom and Laura, who insisted it was fair. But to Elaine, it felt like a concession to a boy who never valued her, her stories, or the legacy she'd spent a lifetime building. She scanned the document again. The house, fully paid off, her retirement accounts, secure. The rare book collection that had taken decades to amass, eagerly eyed by Matt, but never truly appreciated. 40%, because he was family, because Tom and Laura couldn't bear the thought of leaving him with nothing, even if he hadn't earned it. Elaine sighed softly, recalling how Matt always rolled his eyes when she shared a story or asked about his life. How, every birthday, he barely acknowledged her, dismissing her with a glance. She was just an old woman to him, someone to be tolerated at best. Mavis's voice echoed in her mind. Cut him, and don't give him the mercy of a warning. Elaine had no doubt what Mavis meant. There was no mercy in this world for people who thought they were owed everything without lifting a finger. But Elaine wasn't like them. She wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't cry or lash out. She would simply act, quietly, decisively. Elaine picked up the phone and dialed. When the voice on the other end answered, she was already sure of what she needed to say. Savannah Ross, please, Elaine said. There was no hesitation. A soft, professional voice greeted her. This is Savannah. How can I help you? I need to make changes to my estate, Elaine said, her words precise. I want to remove someone from the will. I'd like to set up a revocable living trust and make a few alterations. There was a pause on the other end, Savannah sensing the gravity of the request. I'll need the specifics, Savannah replied gently. What's prompting this decision? Elaine's hand tightened on the phone. The question was simple, but it carried more weight than it appeared. She thought of Matt, his careless cruelty, his belief that the world revolved around him. I don't want revenge, Elaine said, her voice low but firm. I want release. A beat of silence followed before Savannah spoke again. Understood. We'll arrange a meeting. I'll have the paperwork ready for you. Elaine set the phone down slowly, her fingers lingering on the receiver. For a moment, she let the quiet fill the room. Her decision was made. There was no turning back now. She stood, the weight of the action heavy on her shoulders, but strangely freeing too. It was time to claim her silence, time to let the people who had taken her presence for granted feel the absence she would leave behind. Savannah's office was all clean lines and quiet authority. Glass shelves, framed diplomas, and a wide oak desk that looked too heavy to budge. Elaine sat across from her, hands folded neatly in her lap, listening to the scratch of Savannah's pen as it moved through the first set of documents. This part restructures everything into the revocable living trust, Savannah explained, her tone calm but precise. Once it's finalized, your assets transfer under the trust's name. That gives you full control while you're alive, and clarity after. Clarity. Elaine let the word settle. It felt like cool air after a long, suffocating heat. Savannah flipped a page, tapped a line with her finger. This is where your current beneficiaries are listed. Matt's name stared up at Elaine, bold, centered, swollen with expectation. He had always assumed this line belonged to him, that her house, her books, her savings, all her quiet years of work, were nothing more than stepping stones for his own ambitions. She could still hear the way he'd talked about inheriting her home like it was a prize he was overdue for. Savannah gently drew a line through his name. Once I sign and notarize this, Savannah said, he's removed, explicitly and legally. Elaine exhaled, slow, steady. Good, Savannah continued working. I've reduced Tom and Laura's portions as you requested. They'll still receive something, but nowhere near what the previous draft allowed. Elaine nodded. It wasn't about spite. It was about honesty. They had drifted so far from her, choosing convenience over care, image over relationship. Her legacy didn't belong to people who treated her like a burden. Savannah turned the page. Now, the scholarship fund. A soft warmth settled in Elaine's chest. Yes, she murmured. For students here in Charlottesville. Kids who need a door opened. Her fingers brushed the corner of the table. Let the money do more than sit in someone's bank account waiting for a vacation home. Savannah smiled faintly. I'll structure it as a charitable trust. It will run independently and indefinitely. For the first time all morning, Elaine felt something close to excitement. Not joy, exactly. Something steadier. Purpose. A knock sounded on the office door. Mavis stepped in, cheeks flushed from the cold, carrying a shopping bag stuffed with packing supplies. Museum boxes, she said, lifting the bag like a trophy. If we're clearing that study of yours, we're doing it right. Savannah shot Elaine a glance. Are these for the donation you mentioned? Elaine nodded. My first editions, my annotated collections. I want them preserved, displayed. Somewhere they'll be handled with respect. Mavis snorted softly. And not by someone who uses books as coasters. Elaine didn't need Matt's name spoken aloud. The implication was enough. Savannah slid a final document across the desk. One more thing, a no-contest clause. If anyone disputes your choices, even a little, they lose everything. It shuts down challenges before they start. Elaine read the paragraph twice. It was elegant, ironclad, a line drawn in legal concrete. Add it, she said. Savannah made the notation, stamped the page, and retrieved the notary seal. The click of it pressing into paper sounded like the closing of a vault. When the last signature dried, Savannah sat back. Your estate now reflects your intentions, fully and without ambiguity. Elaine rose from her chair slowly, feeling the strange lightness of a burden set down. She looked at the stack of finalized documents, neat, unassuming, devastating in their implications. Matt had believed her silence meant weakness, but silence, she realized, could be a scalpel. Savannah gathered the folder. I'll file these tonight. Once it's submitted, there's no reversing the structure without your explicit instruction. Elaine met her eyes. I don't intend to reverse anything. She turned toward the door, Mavis falling into step beside her. The hallway ahead was long, bright, echoing. As they stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, Mavis leaned close. How do you feel? Elaine paused, staring at the horizon. Like he's about to learn something he was never prepared for. And with that, she opened the car door, unaware that before nightfall, someone else would discover a clue pointing toward what she'd done. Elaine sat across from Matt at the cafe, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, the warm ceramic offering a brief comfort in the otherwise tense silence. He was scrolling through his phone again, his lips moving as if rehearsing words for a stage performance. It was always like this with him, always a performance, always the audience of one, himself. Check this out, Matt said, sliding his phone across the table. The screen was filled with glossy photos of modern condos, sleek, shiny, everything he imagined a future should be. He pointed to one in particular, a high-rise with a panoramic view of the city. This one's perfect. I can see it now, my future rental property. Elaine didn't move to touch the phone. Instead, she studied his face, the way he spoke, the way his eyes danced with the thought of money and future plans, as though he had already claimed everything she owned. Nice, she murmured, her voice neutral, offering no more than the bare minimum. Matt didn't seem to notice the lack of enthusiasm. His fingers tapped restlessly on the table. You should really think about selling the house, Grandma. It's just sitting there now, and I could make some good money off it. You don't need it anymore. Elaine didn't flinch. The house, the thing he assumed was his, would never be his. Not in the way he thought. It was hers, always had been, and would be in ways Matt would never understand. She kept her gaze steady on the coffee cup, unwilling to give him more of her attention. I mean, let's be real, Matt continued, leaning back in his chair. I could turn it into a rental property, start bringing in some cash, really good investment. Elaine kept nodding, her mind adrift. She wasn't listening anymore, not to him, not to his plans for her home, not to his casual dismissals of everything she'd worked for. She had stopped engaging with his words long ago. He leaned in, as though he had saved the best for last. Honestly, Grandma, try not to live too long. I'm just kidding, he added quickly. But the words were already out there, hanging in the air like a rotten fruit. Elaine didn't look up from her mug. She had heard the joke, the cruel jest that danced on the edge of a threat. But there was no anger in her, only a quiet, unwavering certainty. The silence between them stretched. The pressure of it lingered in the air, thick and palpable. Elaine set the mug down gently. She didn't need to react. She didn't need to prove anything to him. She had already made her decision. Her plans were set. He wasn't getting the house or the money or anything else he thought he was entitled to. I think that'll be all for today, Matt, she said, standing and leaving the words hanging between them. He blinked, caught off guard by her calmness. She didn't wait for his response, didn't linger for the fake pleasantries he always had on standby. As she stepped out into the cold air, Mavis's voice echoed in her mind, a soft, dangerous reminder. I'd fake my death just to watch him squirm. Elaine smiled faintly, the thought giving her an odd sense of satisfaction. Later that night, she sat at her desk again, the funeral plans in front of her, private, invite only, with no Norwoods listed. She had planned everything carefully, every detail, every last word. The family would be excluded. Matt, Tom, Laura. They would have to live with the silence she'd left behind. As her fingers closed the folder with quiet finality, she knew one thing for certain. The inheritance Matt thought he was entitled to had already been redefined. And soon he would learn that some legacies aren't meant to be inherited. They're meant to be left behind. The morning light stretched across the desk in warm, pale ribbons. Savannah sat across from Elaine, carefully placing the final documents in front of her. "It's official," she said softly, her tone more reverent than businesslike. "The trust has been filed with the county. Everything is now fully in place." Elaine barely registered the words, her fingers already gliding over the papers, as if making sure they were real, that they were truly hers. She had expected this moment to feel more monumental, but instead, there was just a quiet sense of relief. A weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying now lifted off her shoulders. "Everything's moved into the trust," Savannah continued, her voice gentle but precise. "Bank accounts, the house, everything you've designated." Elaine nodded. She didn't need to ask for specifics. She knew exactly where everything had gone. The trust was airtight now, with her in full control. The money, the house, even her rare book collection, all protected under her careful design. It was a final unbreakable gesture. The things that had mattered to her, safeguarded from people who would never understand. Savannah glanced down at the file in front of her, flipping through the last few papers. "The Historical Archive has accepted your book collection as well. They'll treat it with the respect it deserves." Elaine's lips curved slightly. Her collection wasn't just books to her. It was her history, her soul. Matt had never cared for them, of course, dismissing them as old relics that didn't matter. But they would matter to someone, somewhere, long after she was gone. "Perfect," Elaine said, her voice steady. "Thank you, Savannah." As Savannah stood to leave, Elaine walked to the window, staring out at the street below. It was a sunny day, but there was something strangely heavy about it. Everything felt different, as if the very air had shifted in anticipation of something to come. That evening, Mavis showed up at the house, arms laden with bags. Elaine had asked her to help organize what they were calling a farewell party. Mavis had taken the idea and run with it, transforming the living room into a place of light and joy, despite its heavy subtext. "You've really outdone yourself, Mavis," Elaine said, surveying the room. There were no black-clad guests, no somber music. Instead, the room was filled with soft yellow light, a scattering of flowers, and glasses of wine. Mavis smiled, adjusting the little arrangements on the table. "Well, you said it's not a wake. It's a celebration, right?" She handed Elaine a glass of wine. "Now, don't get too emotional on me. We're here to enjoy ourselves." Elaine's lips curled into a small smile. For joy, not death. The doorbell rang, and soon the house was filled with familiar faces. Neighbors, a few former colleagues, even a couple of distant cousins. The people who had, in one way or another, kept Elaine company throughout her life. No Norwoods showed up. Elaine didn't expect them to. They had been too busy with their own lives, too quick to dismiss her. This party was for those who had truly cared. Later in the evening, as the laughter and chatter filled the space, Elaine retreated for a moment to the quiet of her study. The phone on the desk buzzed with a call she knew was coming. "Elaine," Tom's voice crackled over the line. "Why weren't we invited?" Elaine's expression remained impassive as she sat back in the chair. There was no surprise in his tone, only irritation. He had assumed he would be here, just as he had always assumed things would go his way. But not this time. "It was for people who've kept me company," Elaine replied softly, the words landing with the weight of finality. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a frustrated exhale. "You're making a mistake, Mom." Elaine could almost hear the impatience in his voice, the same impatience she had seen so many times before. The entitlement, but she wasn't interested in his apologies or his justifications anymore. She didn't owe him anything. "I'm not making a mistake, Tom," she said, her voice calm. "I've already made my decision." The line went silent for a moment. Then, as if he had been expecting something else, Tom spoke again, this time with a colder edge. You'll regret this. Elaine smiled faintly, looking at the walls of books that lined the study, books that had been carefully chosen, loved, and kept. Unlike the people who had always taken her for granted. I won't, she said simply, then hung up the phone. Her gaze returned to the window. The party continued in the other room, a joyful noise, a celebration of a life well lived. A life not defined by the people who had assumed it would all be theirs. She raised her glass, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the evening light. She had made her peace. Let them learn, too late, what it meant to be truly heard. The phone buzzed sharply on the table, and Elaine glanced down to see the notification from Savannah. She didn't need to open the message to know what it was about. The weight of it settled on her like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Matt's post. Of course. Elaine sighed softly, pushing the cup of tea aside as she opened her phone and swiped through to the image. It was a screenshot, a photo of a post that Matt had made earlier that afternoon. A careless remark, a bite of digital venom, aimed squarely at her. The words were blunt, almost shocking in their cruelty. He had tagged her, as though she were some afterthought in his narrative, some elderly woman whose absence he couldn't wait to cash in on. Glad I'll be rid of that old house soon. Should have done this years ago. Can't wait to flip it. Elaine stared at the post for a long moment, the words growing fuzzier the longer she looked at them. Can't wait to flip it. Her house, her life, her legacy. Just something to be flipped for a profit. Her heart didn't race with anger. It was something colder, something too quiet to be anger. She had anticipated this, of course. It had been inevitable. But the casual cruelty of it stung nonetheless. Savannah's message was clear and practical, as always. We now have written justification if this ever goes public. Elaine set the phone down slowly. Savannah was right. It didn't matter now. The damage was done, but it had given her everything she needed. Proof, written proof, of Matt's true nature. The world would know now, if it ever came to that. He had made it impossible for anyone to believe he had any right to what she had worked for. Elaine unfriended him on every platform, one click after another. First Instagram, then Facebook, then Twitter. Each click felt like an anchor being pulled from the sea, each connection severed with precision and finality. She would not be part of his narrative anymore. Once done, she turned her attention to the frames that lined the walls. Pictures from years gone by, moments frozen in time. She had kept them out of habit, some with Matt, some with Tom and Laura. But now they seemed like ghosts, reminders of a time when she believed family meant something more than obligation. With a steady hand, Elaine began removing the photos. She didn't rush, but methodically took each frame down, one after another. They clattered softly as they landed in the pile she had started by the fireplace. It was almost satisfying, the act of clearing the walls, of clearing her space, her heart. The silence it left in the room felt like a breath she'd been holding for too long. She didn't want reminders anymore. Not of him, not of any of them. They would remain in the past, where they belonged. The doorbell rang, breaking her reverie. Mavis stepped in, carrying a small potted plant, its vibrant green leaves a contrast to the grayness outside. I thought the room could use some life, she said, setting the plant down on the table with a wink. Elaine smiled faintly, appreciating the quiet gesture. Let's fill the room with people who grow, Mavis added, as though reading her thoughts. Elaine nodded, her fingers brushing the leaves gently. Yes, she said softly, her voice filled with an unexpected tenderness. Let's. Later, as the evening settled into darkness, Elaine sat in her study, reviewing the new documents that Savannah had brought over, her updated legal power of attorney. It had been one of the final steps. She glanced at the signatures that had been added in bold ink. Mavis and Savannah, the only people she trusted now. The weight of the pages in her hands felt more like liberation than legalities. Mavis and Savannah would be the ones who would act in her stead. Two people who had never taken her for granted, who had always shown her respect and care. They would honor her wishes when she was gone, when Matt and Tom had nothing to say about it. Elaine folded the papers carefully and set them aside. She stared at the wall opposite her, where now only the shadows lingered, empty spaces where photographs had once stood. Matt would learn soon enough what it meant to be excluded, to be left behind. What he had taken for granted was now beyond his reach, and it was too late for him to change anything. Elaine's lips curled into a soft, quiet smile. He would never hear from her again. Elaine sat in the sun-dappled corner of her study, the window open just enough to let in a breeze. A low hum of voices floated in from the street below, but she barely heard them. Her thoughts were too busy, the weight of the decisions she'd made pressing down in a way she'd long since grown accustomed to. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, pulling her from her reverie. She rose slowly, her steps light but sure, and made her way down the hall. Mavis was standing at the door, her arms full of papers, a lightness in her step that contrasted with the tension of the day. "The Preservation Agency's coming today?" Mavis asked, looking around with a raised brow as she stepped inside. Elaine nodded. "Yes. I wanted to make sure everything was in place. I'll need them to help maintain the house after I'm gone." The words felt heavy in the air, but not in the way they once had. Elaine had long since embraced the reality of her own mortality. It wasn't the fear of death that had driven her decisions. It was the desire to protect what mattered, to ensure that her legacy wasn't hijacked by those who had no understanding of its value. Mavis set the papers down on the coffee table, her eyes curious but steady. "What's the plan?" Elaine paused, glancing toward the house. She'd spent years here, decades even, making it her own, layering memories into its walls until it felt like an extension of herself. But the house wasn't meant to become another commodity, something to be sold, flipped, and forgotten. "I've arranged for it to be an artist's residency," Elaine said, her voice calm but resolute. "It'll be rent-free, a space for artists to create without the pressure of commercialization." Mavis smiled, her eyes alight with approval. "So they can't even Airbnb your memory?" she asked, her voice light, though Elaine could hear the undercurrent of something deeper in her words. Elaine's lips twitched upward. Exactly. She had left explicit instructions that the house should never be turned into a commercial property, never sold for profit, never turned into another heartless investment. It would belong to art, to the preservation of something real, a place where creativity could flourish, away from the clutches of corporate greed. The Property Preservation Agency would oversee it, keeping it intact, ensuring that it remained as she'd intended. Her home would become a sanctuary for those who appreciated the value of something untouched by time's market-driven demands. After Mavis left, Elaine sat at her desk, her fingers tracing the edges of the folder containing her health directive. The decisions she had made were becoming clearer with every passing moment, clear and final. She picked up the pen, her hand steady, and made the final adjustments to her directive. She had already made arrangements with her attorney, Savannah, to ensure her medical wishes were known. But now it was time to make the specifics clear. No hospital contact for Tom or Matt. There would be no last-minute reconciliations, no sudden pleas for forgiveness or family interventions. When the time came, it would be on her terms, quietly, privately, without the interference of those who had always taken her for granted. She could almost hear Savannah's voice in her mind as she signed the papers. "They'll only find out what they've lost after you're gone." Elaine sat back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. A sense of calm settled over her, calm that had come from knowing she had done everything she could to ensure that the life she had built would remain untouched, unbroken by those who had failed to see its worth. "Good," she whispered softly to the empty room. "That's when they'll have time to sit in silence." The silence was now hers to command. She had taken the steps, made the plans. Matt and Tom would have their time, but it would be a time spent in reflection, alone, without her, without the legacy they had never understood. Elaine folded the papers and set them aside. The rest of the evening passed in quiet contemplation, the house empty, save for the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Everything she had worked for was now secure, waiting for the world to catch up. And when the time came, she would be gone, leaving behind nothing but the silence of absence and the quiet power of a life well lived. Elaine sat in the soft glow of the kitchen, the quiet hum of her house settling around her like a blanket. The doorbell rang sharply, breaking the stillness. She knew exactly who it was before the first knock, Laura. Her daughter-in-law always arrived with the same practiced air of urgency, as though her entrance could rewrite everything that had been said. Elaine rose slowly from the chair, smoothing the edges of her cardigan as she crossed the room. When she opened the door, Laura stood there, far too overdressed for the occasion, her face a mask of rehearsed concern. She clutched a vase of lilies, their white petals stark against the muted colors of the porch, their fragrance too sharp in the still air. "Elaine," Laura said, forcing a smile, "I'm so sorry to intrude. I just wanted to bring these. Matt feels terrible. He didn't mean it. He was just angry." Elaine's eyes drifted to the lilies in Laura's hands, their bright, almost clinical whiteness, a sharp contrast to the muted hues of the evening. She hadn't expected an apology, certainly not from Matt, but here it was, offered in the form of flowers and hollow words. Elaine didn't take the bouquet. She didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on Laura, sharp, quiet, unreadable. "He meant it enough to say it," Elaine replied, her voice steady, the weight of years in her tone. Laura shifted slightly, as though uncomfortable in the quiet of the porch, the space between them feeling far too wide. "He's just young, Elaine. He doesn't understand the weight of what he says." Elaine's lips pressed together, the words hitting her like a well-worn refrain. "So was I once," she said, a quiet sharpness in her voice. "But I listened." The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken, what Laura couldn't or wouldn't understand. Elaine had once been young, full of fire, full of desire to please, to be understood. But she had learned. She had learned to listen, to hear what was said between the lines, to hear the truth in silence, in the way people act, rather than what they say. Matt hadn't learned that yet. Neither had Tom, or Laura for that matter. "I know Matt's never understood you," Laura said softly, almost pleading. "But if you could just give him a chance." Elaine cut her off with a soft shake of her head. "No," she said simply, her voice calm. "I've given him more chances than he's ever deserved." Laura opened her mouth to say something else, but before she could speak, a low murmur came from the kitchen, almost drowned out by the silence of the room. Mavis's voice, as always, precise and biting, carried from the next room. "You know, lily's the flower of death, you know." Elaine's lips curled slightly at the words, an echo of the past. Mavis was never far from her thoughts, always with a perfectly timed remark. Laura's eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen, as if seeking reassurance, but Elaine didn't look away. The truth was there, in the way Mavis had always seen through the facade. A flower for death, yes. Because no matter how much Matt or Laura or any of them tried, nothing could fix what had been broken between them. Laura blinked, her face flushing with discomfort, and glanced down at the lilies in her hands. I just wanted to make things right, for Matt's sake, for the family." Elaine took a step back, her gaze still steady on Laura's face. "You can't fix what wasn't broken by me," she said, her voice low and unwavering. "You can't mend things with flowers or apologies, not when the damage is done." Laura didn't have an answer to that. She stood there, the vase now seeming to weigh heavy in her hands, as though the simple act of offering it had already been drained of meaning. The silence stretched between them again, suffocating the air. "Matt doesn't need your apology," Elaine added softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "He needs to learn what it means to listen, to understand." Laura took one last uncertain look at her, then lowered her gaze to the flowers. She didn't say another word. She turned, a quick movement, too quick, as if she couldn't stand the quiet any longer. She left without another glance back, her steps retreating down the path and into the world that didn't understand her. Elaine stood in the doorway, watching her go, the silence closing in again around her. She didn't feel anger or sorrow anymore, only a calm, the kind of peace that only comes when everything has already been decided. She closed the door softly behind her and turned back to the empty kitchen. Mavis, ever present, was still sitting at the table, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Well, that was a waste of time," Mavis muttered, picking up a wineglass and swirling it absent-mindedly. "But it does look like you got the flowers you deserve." Elaine smiled faintly, looking at the now empty vase on the table. The flowers wouldn't last long. None of it would. But by then, It wouldn't matter anymore. And that, she thought, was the true power of silence. Elaine locked the signed documents in her safe with a soft click, her fingers lingering on the cool metal of the lock. It felt final, even though it wasn't the end. She'd secured everything, her home, her legacy, the things she'd worked so hard for. It was now beyond the reach of Tom, Matt, or anyone else who thought they had a claim to it. Savannah had been efficient, transferring all the deeds into the trust's name. The house, the property. Nothing was left unaccounted for. It was done. Elaine could feel the weight lift from her chest, the pressure of unspoken expectations falling away. She looked at the safe for a moment, then at the piles of paper on her desk. Everything in its place, all the boxes checked. She had thought about this for years, planned every detail with care, and now it was complete. Later, Elaine sat in the dim light of the study, drafting her obituary. It was a cold task, a clinical one, but she was accustomed to this kind of finality. Short, clear, factual. Elaine Norwood, 78, passed away peacefully at home, survived by no immediate family. A private service will be held, nothing more, no family names, no elaborate statements. She didn't need to say anything more. The truth was there in the simplicity. There would be no one left to misinterpret her legacy, no one to claim her story as their own. The rest of the world could fill in the gaps, but they wouldn't know her. Not the way she'd wanted to be known. She set the pen down and took a breath, the weight of the decision settling in. The next task was her antiques. She had already arranged for the university art department to receive them, pieces that had been cared for, loved, now going to people who would appreciate their value. There was no reason to leave them behind for anyone who hadn't earned them. Mavis's voice came to her again. They wanted your foundation, now they'll get your absence. Elaine's lips curved into a small smile. It was exactly what she wanted. Let them search for meaning in her absence. Let them try to understand what they'd lost when it was too late. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Matt. Of course. For a moment, she stared at his name on the screen. Then with a single swipe, she opened his contact page. Delete contact. A small vibration confirmed it. Just like that, he was gone from her life. Erased, no longer a part of the narrative she was writing. Elaine set the phone down and looked around the room, the silence stretching around her like a comfortable blanket. The house felt as it always had, except now there was no weight to carry, no expectation to meet. She had made her choices. Everything was now set in motion. The world would go on, but she would be gone. And when they finally understood, it would be too late. Elaine smiled quietly to herself and stood up, closing the drawer to her desk. There was nothing left but the waiting. And she had waited long enough. Elaine stared at the screen of her phone, Tom's voicemail blinking at her. She knew what it would say before she even played it. Apologies, excuses, and the same hollow attempt to manipulate her into doubt. She pressed play, hearing his voice come through, thick with regret. Elaine, I know I've made mistakes. Matt. He's been out of control, and I should have stepped in sooner. Please just call me back when you get this. I'm trying to fix things. Elaine's expression didn't change. She let it finish, the words sinking into the air without leaving any trace. She didn't need to hear it again. She deleted the message without hesitation. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just an empty sense of completion. He would never understand. They all thought the regret would come from her, but it was they who would feel it, eventually. Setting the phone aside, she felt the space around her fill with the quiet she had made her peace with. There would be no more apologies, no more pleading. She had already made her choice. She would never return to that place of waiting. Later that evening, she found herself at the community reading night at the local library. It had been years since she had attended one, but tonight she felt compelled. She slipped into the back, unnoticed, letting the familiar hum of soft voices and rustling pages surround her. There was something peaceful about the stillness in the room. When the time came, Elaine found herself standing, walking to the front without a second thought. She opened the well-worn pages of the Scarlet Letter, her voice soft but clear as she read a passage about dignity and silence. She had gone to that pillar of shame. and stood there for 3 hours, in the full light of the noonday, to meet the crowd. But there was something more. Her soul had not been left in that moment. And there, with the crowd, she had learned the meaning of silence. Elaine's voice carried in the room, quiet but steady. As she finished, she stood there for a moment, the weight of the words settling into the stillness around her. There was no applause. There didn't need to be. The words had done their work. Afterward, Savannah met her for tea at a nearby cafe. She sat across from Elaine, studying her with a quiet kind of respect. "You look different," Savannah said. "Feels lighter, doesn't it?" Elaine nodded, a small smile forming. "The silence used to hurt. Now it's holy." Savannah's gaze softened. "You're quieter, but sharper." Elaine met her eyes, her heart calm. "I've learned to listen," she said, her voice steady. "And I've learned that some silences speak louder than words." As they sat in the fading light of the cafe, the world outside felt far away. She had made her peace, and in that peace, there was power. The silence was hers now, unbroken, unchallenged, and exactly what she needed. Elaine stared at her phone, Matt's name flashing on the screen. She could feel the weight of the unread message, but it didn't matter. She already knew what it would say. More regret, more apologies, more of the same hollow words. She didn't need to hear it. Her hearing aids buzzed faintly in her ears. A quiet reminder that she was still here, still alive, still present in a world that had been drifting away from her for years. With a slow, deliberate motion, she locked her phone and set it aside, returning her focus to the small jar of homemade jam in front of her. The familiar motions of spooning it into jars were comforting, grounding. The sweetness of it was the only thing that seemed real now. She filled the jars carefully, moving methodically from one to the next, until she had a small basket filled with them. Then, with a steady hand, she attached a simple note to the basket. "Thank you for still using quiet voices." The library would know what she meant. They always did. She had given them so much of herself over the years, books, time, memories. But this would be her final gift, one last gesture of appreciation. When she finished, Mavis entered the room, a knowing look in her eyes. "Sending more gifts, I see." Elaine didn't answer right away. She simply watched as Mavis inspected the basket. "They'll appreciate it," Elaine said quietly, her voice steady but sure. Mavis glanced over at the phone, still sitting unused on the table. "I see Matt's text. You didn't reply?" Elaine shook her head. "There's nothing to say." Mavis smiled faintly, the sharpness in her voice softened by something more affectionate. "Good. You've got enough to say without words. A jar of jam says it all." Elaine smiled too, a faint curl of her lips, as she handed the basket to Mavis. "Could you drop it off at the library for me?" "Of course," Mavis replied, taking the basket without hesitation. As Mavis walked out the door, Elaine stood by the window, looking out at the world she had come to understand better than most. The house was quiet again, the way it had been when she first moved in, before it became a battleground for family. She felt a quiet peace wash over her. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't even look at it. The silence was hers now, and she had no intention of breaking it. The world outside could wait. What Matt wanted, what Tom and Laura expected, it didn't matter anymore. It never had. She picked up the jar of jam again and set it down gently, watching the sun's last light flicker against the glass. For the first time in a long time, Elaine felt that the quiet was not a void to be filled, but a place she could finally call her own. Elaine sat in her study, her phone resting in front of her. She had already seen the post from Laura, shared by a mutual friend, an open, public message of reconciliation, of family unity. "It's been a hard time for the Norwood family lately, but we're working through it. We need to stay united, for Matt, for our legacy." Elaine stared at the screen for a long moment. She didn't need to read it again. She knew exactly what it was, a performance, a clean narrative that painted them as victims, as people who were doing their best. The words were too perfect, too neatly packaged. The damage had been done long before this. Now, they were just putting on a show for the public. Mavis entered quietly, as always, and without needing to ask, she glanced at the phone in Elaine's hand. "Laura's post?" Elaine nodded, setting the phone down. A performance, she said, her voice low. But it doesn't matter. The damage is already done. Mavis crossed the room and took a seat at the table, her eyes sharp. You don't owe them anything, Elaine, not even an explanation. Elaine sighed, feeling the familiar weight of frustration settle in her chest. She had spent years listening, swallowing everything they said, trying to keep the peace. But now it was her turn to speak. I know, she said, her voice steady. But I think I owe myself a story. Mavis raised an eyebrow, curious. A story? Elaine stood, moving over to her desk and pulling out a notebook. I've been listening all my life, to things left unsaid, to things no one bothered to hear. She looked at Mavis, her gaze steady. I think it's time I told my side. Over the following days, Elaine began writing. Short essays, reflections on her life, her family, the silences that had shaped her. She titled them The Art of Hearing What Isn't Said. They weren't angry, but they were sharp, filled with the kind of clarity that came only after years of holding everything inside. Mavis read the drafts aloud as Elaine sat beside her, watching her carefully. You've made your point, Mavis remarked after one essay, her voice warm with approval, sharp as glass and twice as clear. Elaine smiled faintly. It was a quiet kind of rebellion, this act of writing. She wasn't speaking to them, to Matt or Tom or Laura. She was speaking to herself. And if the world heard it, so be it. The essays found a place in a local newsletter, one Elaine had been subscribed to for years. She never expected much of a response, just a few readers who appreciated the same quiet she did. But to her surprise, the feedback was kind, respectful. People were listening. One evening, Savannah joined Elaine for tea, the gentle clink of cups filling the room. I see you found your voice, Savannah said, her tone thoughtful. It feels different, doesn't it? Elaine met her gaze, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It feels like I've been heard for the first time. Savannah nodded, her eyes wise. It's funny, isn't it? How the world only notices when you stop trying to make them understand you. Elaine's smile deepened, the truth of it settling into her bones. I've stopped trying, she said softly, but I've finally found my story, and that, she realized, was the most important thing. No longer would she let them define her. No longer would she bend to their demands for explanation. The silence that had once felt like a prison had become her sanctuary, and in that silence, she had found the strength to speak. As she gazed out the window, the world outside continued as it always had. But for the first time in years, Elaine felt as though the story was finally hers to tell. Elaine's phone buzzed once again, a familiar sound, though this time she didn't look away from the window. She had learned not to expect much of these messages. Each one felt like another attempt at reclaiming control, another attempt to rewrite history. But when she finally glanced at the screen, her eyes fell on Matt's name. The message was short, a meager offering of apology wrapped in vague regret. Elaine, I didn't mean it. I was just mad. Please understand. I was frustrated, and I said things I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. She didn't need to read it again. She knew what it said, word for word, but something made her tap it open anyway. There it was, his apology, his version of a correction, the same one she had always heard. I didn't mean it. It's not really me. I was just mad. Elaine set the phone down, but she didn't let go of the words. She let them hang in the air for a moment, feeling the thinness of them, the emptiness. His apology had no substance. The damage wasn't something that could be undone with a few words. She didn't need to underline anything to dissect what he said. It was too late for that. She read it twice, silently, then folded the phone and placed it on the table. Slowly, she rose and walked to her desk, where a folder sat open, labeled Unsent Messages. She slid the phone into the folder, the decision final, like tucking a letter in an envelope she would never send. It was safe there, but that didn't mean it had any more value than the words she'd already heard. Savannah was sitting on the couch, a book in her hands, a warm cup of tea by her side. She had been quiet, giving Elaine space, but the moment was familiar. Savannah didn't need to ask what the letter said. Want me to archive that too, she asked, her voice soft but knowing. The question was not just about the letter, it was about what Elaine was going to do with it. Would she respond? Would she go back into the noise? Elaine shook her head slowly, a small smile curling her lips. No, let it live long enough to haunt him. Savannah didn't argue. She simply nodded and went back to her book. But Elaine could see the approval in her eyes. There was no need to give Matt the satisfaction of an answer, no need to provide closure where there was none to be had. She had already closed that door. Now it was time for him to face the silence. Elaine stepped away from the desk, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder. The finality of it settled around her like a gentle weight. She didn't need to revisit those words. The past, after all, was an echo, not a force she had to contend with anymore. She slipped on her jacket, a sudden urge to go somewhere pushing her forward. The night was cool, the sky darkening as the sun slipped away, and Elaine felt the need to move, to drive, to escape the stillness of the house, to leave the thoughts of Matt, of everything behind for just a moment. The drive through the park was peaceful, the hum of the tires on the road a steady rhythm beneath the wind in the air. She opened the windows halfway, letting the breeze rush through the car, the sound of it faintly amplified by the hum of her hearing aids. She hadn't driven in a while, hadn't felt the world move beneath her in the way it did when she was alone, when she wasn't carrying anyone else's weight. The wind seemed to wash everything away, taking the weight of the words, of the apologies, and leaving only the feeling of motion, of her own presence. The park was quiet, the trees whispering in the wind as she drove through it, her headlights cutting through the night. She didn't need to go anywhere particular. It was enough to be in motion, to be away from the house, away from everything that had been decided. Elaine didn't look at the phone again. She didn't need to. The world could wait. Tonight, she was just herself, with nothing left to prove to anyone. The silence between her and Matt would remain, and in that silence, she had found her peace. The car turned onto a small road that led toward the open fields, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The silence was hers to command now. The world would catch up when it was ready. Elaine sat across from Savannah at the small conference table in the law office. It was a quiet, almost clinical space, walls lined with legal books and the faint scent of polished wood. Savannah had already prepared the documents, neatly organized in front of them. Elaine's fingers brushed the edges of the papers, feeling the weight of each one. Medical clearance, witnesses, notarizations. Every detail had been accounted for. The rumors had already begun, the whispers in the background of Tom and Laura's attempts to tarnish her decisions. They thought they could claim her silence as evidence of weakness, accuse her of not being of sound mind when making the trust arrangements. But Elaine had already prepared for that. She had seen it coming, and she had ensured there would be no room for doubt. Savannah slid a document toward her, the final piece in a meticulous puzzle. "Once we file these, they won't be able to touch it," Savannah said, her voice calm but filled with certainty. "This is bulletproof." Elaine nodded, the decision final. There was no second-guessing anymore. Everything had been done on her terms, her legacy safely tucked away, beyond the reach of those who thought they could take it. She signed the papers, each stroke of her pen marking the end of the line. Savannah added a final touch, filing the documents with a quiet click of her computer. "We're ready," she said, standing up and collecting the papers. "The rumor dies here, Elaine. There's no way for them to dispute this. Not without looking like fools." Elaine's lips curled into a faint smile, the satisfaction of control settling into her bones. The people who had tried to bend her to their will, to take what was hers, they had already lost. And now they would be left with nothing. Later that day, Mavis joined Elaine in the yard, her footsteps light on the grass. Elaine was kneeling by the flower beds, her hands in the soil. The garden had always been a refuge, a place where she could ground herself and see life bloom in ways that were quiet and real. Mavis glanced over at the rows of roses Elaine had been planting, a knowing look in her eyes. "Roses, huh? One for each person you've outgrown." Elaine smiled faintly, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. "One for each. Some were more difficult to let go of than others." The roses were different colors: red for love, white for peace, yellow for those who had never understood her. Each one had a purpose. Each one was planted with intention. They were a way to mark the past, to acknowledge the people who had been part of her life, whether they had stayed or gone. Mavis tilted her head, watching Elaine as she worked. "You've muted them beautifully," she said, her voice a touch softer than usual. "But I think you've done more than that. You've outgrown them, and they'll never get that." Elaine paused, looking down at the roses with a quiet sense of finality. "They'll learn, but it will be too late for them to understand." As she finished planting the last of the roses, Elaine stood back and surveyed the garden. The flowers were not yet fully bloomed, but already their potential was clear. She had nurtured them, tended to them, and now they were growing on their own, just like the life she had built for herself. Savannah's voice echoed in her mind. "You've bulletproofed yourself." Elaine took a deep breath, letting the quiet satisfaction of her choices fill her. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about peace, about creating something beautiful that no one could take from her. The last of the roses was planted. The garden was hers. And with that, Elaine walked back toward the house, the silence surrounding her feeling more like a triumph than a loss. The world would catch up when it was ready. Until then, she was exactly where she needed to be. Years passed, and life in Elaine's house had settled into a gentle rhythm. The roses in the garden had long since bloomed in full color, their petals reaching toward the sky in bright defiance. Every time she stepped outside, the sight of them, red, white, yellow, reminded her of the choices she'd made, the life she had reclaimed. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Elaine had been expecting it for months, though she had never truly anticipated how it would feel when it finally came. Matt had learned the truth. He had walked into the lawyer's office with all the expectations of a man who thought he was entitled to something that had never been his. The letter from the trust told him everything he needed to know. Fully disinherited. No inheritance, no claim. The weight of his entitlement had been lifted, and now he would face the reality of his own actions. Elaine didn't have to read the letter herself. She didn't need to. She had known this day would come, the moment when Matt's misguided sense of ownership would finally be shattered. She smiled to herself when she thought of it, how quickly the silence she had cultivated would come crashing down on him. The trust's public letter, printed for all to see, included one sentence that Elaine would never take back. "Silence is not absence, it is choice." Those words, her words, would stand as a permanent mark in the world for anyone who cared to read them. They weren't just a statement about her estate. They were about everything she had chosen to say and everything she had chosen not to. The silence she had embraced was not born of weakness, but of strength. Meanwhile, the scholarship fund she had established in her name grew, quietly, as Elaine had hoped. Each recipient received not just financial support, but a letter from Elaine's personal archive. You were heard. She knew that the true inheritance was never about money or property. It was about ensuring that the stories of those who had been overlooked were finally given space. Their voices, too, deserved to be heard, even if it had taken Elaine's silence to make it happen. Mavis visited one afternoon, her usual presence like a breath of fresh air in the quiet house. She made her way to the garden, where the roses were now in full bloom, and stood for a long moment, her eyes taking in the riot of colors. "They're beautiful," Mavis said softly, her gaze lingering on the flowers. "Just like everything you've done. You've built something here, Elaine." Elaine nodded, standing beside her, her hands clasped behind her back. She had built something, all right. It wasn't about the roses or the house or the trust. It was about the silence she had created, the peace. "Funny thing," Elaine said, her voice a soft murmur. "I haven't missed their noise once." Mavis chuckled lightly, her eyes crinkling at the edges. "I don't think they ever understood that silence isn't empty. It's just full of things they were never ready to hear." Elaine smiled. The years had given her the clarity she had longed for, the understanding that silence, when chosen, could be its own kind of answer. They sat together on the porch, sipping tea in the golden afternoon light. Birdsong filled the air, and the soft rustle of the leaves in the breeze created a perfect harmony with the stillness of the moment. There was no regret here, no looking back. Only the peace of knowing that she had made the right choices for herself. Elaine took another sip of her tea, looking out at the garden, her fingers curling around the warm cup. "My grandson told me to hurry up and die already," she said quietly, her voice thick with the weight of the years, "because he thought I didn't hear him. so I made sure the only thing he'd hear from me again was silence and absence. Mavis didn't need to say anything. The words hung between them, final but not sad. The silence that had been forced upon Elaine was now a gift, a weapon, and a shield. And as the birds sang and the roses bloomed, Elaine knew that in her silence, she had found everything she needed. The world outside might never understand, but that was their burden, not hers. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Elaine closed her eyes, content in the knowledge that she had outlived them all. The noise would fade, but the silence would remain, powerful, unbroken, and her own.